So here we are back in week two. You survived week one, congratulations. Only 9 weeks to go because, as you know, this class has no final exam, so you'll basically be done at the end of week 10, which is pretty sweet. Okay, so after we've seen in week one the introduction to this class and a series of important authors in the history of political science, in week two we do ideology. Okay, ideology is really cool. There's a whole class that is offered by my department, which is a whole 10 weeks on ideology, and it's a pretty cool class. I like it a lot. But first of all, what is an ideology? Okay, so the book basically says that the ideology is a group of ideas that are packaged together to create some sort of coherent view of politics and of how politics should be. Okay? This language of ideology is very, very important because it's the way that people speak, and even people that don't think they have an ideology very often do have an ideology or an ideological agenda, okay? And so we must understand it if we want to be political citizens in our modern world, okay? It's like understanding ideology is a little bit like having a passport that you need to travel. Understanding ideology is your passport to having political conversations that make some sense, okay? And it doesn't mean that you have to stay coherent to one ideology. Your personal ideology can pick and mix, but you have to know what you're picking and mixing from, okay? So at page 63 of the book, of the physical book, I don't know what it's gonna be on Unravel, but in any case, you have a big list of sources. Your political education and information depends on you and you only. And you've seen that in the list of approved sources that I've posted on Canvas that you can draw your little articles from to post in your discussions, there are some sources that are more conservative and there are some sources that are more liberal. And I did that on purpose so that you can be exposed to different points of view, okay? So the wording of things matters a lot because there are some words that belong to one ideology and some words that belong to another ideology. And political parties are well aware of this. So for example, if we talk to people about welfare, a lot of people are going to have a negative conception of welfare because in America, people think that welfare makes people dependent and that people are never going to be able to fend for themselves and find a job if they are on welfare for too long. But as soon as we start talking about helping the poor, then all of a sudden helping the poor seems something that is necessary, that we have to do, okay? But helping the poor and welfare, aren't they the same thing after all? So be very careful about how words are used within a certain political culture, okay? Next week, in week 3, we're going to see how America is divided between different political cultures, and there's a certain author that is going to say that basically America is many countries all rolled into one, okay? So, before we start talking about ideologies now, we have to see the history of ideologies a little bit, okay? So, we start from the word liberal, okay? So, liberal has to do with liberty, okay? With some sort of personal liberty, personal freedom. And it's interesting because liberal means left only in America. All around the world, liberal means a certain way of being right-wing, or more like liberal in terms of like rights, but then it's associated with being right-wing and like libertarian in terms of economics, okay? So it started from this idea of like conceding individual political liberties to people, okay? And the idea is that you create liberal democracy by giving people representation, by letting people vote in democratic elections, and by giving them civil liberties not to be incarcerated, okay? Also, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, it's definitely part of an early liberal conception, okay? So you have to understand that at first, once people were coming out of authoritarian governments, kingdoms, empires, there was the idea that negative liberty was something that you had to gain for people, okay? What is negative liberty? Is freedom from abuse, freedom from being killed, freedom from violence, freedom from slavery, okay? That's negative liberty. So this is also why nationalism was a positive force and was considered to be at the left of politics. Today, nationalism is to the right of politics in the 1800s, because peoples were not free to be whatever they wanted to be, but they were under empires, under tyrants. And so nationalism was important because it liberated some nations from tyranny. Okay? After you obtain that and you create the first states, which we're going to see next week is going to be all focused on the creation of states, then you say, well, it's not enough. People are dying young, people can't read or write, people don't have insurance, okay? And in particular, this is very important for those that are not the status quo, married, straight, white males, okay? Those were the only people that had liberties at the beginning. Then everybody else, women couldn't vote, women couldn't speak in public, people were enslaved, people who were not white had no political clout in America, okay? And so little by little, we expand liberties and we incorporate positive liberties, liberty to have an education, liberty to be healthy, and so on and so forth, okay? And so it's actually because of the Great Depression, which elicited a lot of policies that are liberal in the modern, more social sense, that we associate liberalism with the left in the US, okay? And some of you might even know that there's a term neoliberal, which is actually more linked to that old idea of liberal, which is right-wing liberal, okay? Neoliberal policies, neoliberal adjustments, neoliberal policies of like the World Bank, for example, in the international sphere, okay? On the other side, we've just talked about liberalism. We have to talk about conservatism. I know that you have a whole reading about conservatism, like the 10 principles of conservatism, and I'm going to talk about it in a separate part. But even the textbook, what do they say about conservatism? That it's made of basically three things combined, okay? On one side, we have the core of classic liberalism, small government, people are responsible for their own property. If people are poor or if people are unlucky, it's just because of bad choices. And help from the states only creates problems. Taxing the rich is bad because the rich will move their money somewhere else. Okay? So this is the core of classic liberalism, which is one of the roots of modern conservatism. Then we have the idea of tradition. The idea of tradition behind conservatism is that we need experience, and that fast change and revolution can only disrupt the order of society. So you can see that conservatism has a root of prudence, has a root of tradition, okay? The main divide in today's conservatism is religion, okay? Because on one side you can be conservative and religious, and on the other side you can be conservative and not religious. And what's the main issue that divides conservatives, even if now the majority of conservatism, of conservatives are on one side of this? It's abortion. But up until like the 1970s, there were many people in the Republican Party who were pro-choice, okay? Only recently the Republican Party has been very aligned with pro-life, okay? So we have two more of the main ideologies, socialism and fascism, okay? We've seen the ideas of Karl Marx last week. I will just give you one more snippet of socialism, okay? What's the idea behind socialism? Is being anti-free market and believing that society is rooted in class conflict. It's the idea that capitalism will create inequality and there's nothing we can do about it, and that the free market is not fair. And if we don't correct the free market, then we're going to end up with a society where there are very few rich people and then everybody else is going to be poor, okay? And so we need to do something about inequality. The book also briefly talks about communism. Okay, communism is a bad word. Why is communism a bad word? Because communism in reality was basically a terrible authoritarian nightmare degeneration of the ideas of socialism. Okay, communists abolished private property, which is one of the things that the socialists were saying, and then took all the power and maintained all the power for 70 years. and sent people to gulags, to prison camps, and were responsible for killing tens of millions of people all around the world. Okay, so it's basically taking one of probably the best, most revolutionary ideas of the 19th century and turning it into a little bit of a nightmare. Okay, which is why it gets such a bad reputation. And it's only fair that communism gets such a bad reputation. What you have to understand is that there's a gigantic difference between a Stalinist communist and a social democrat. Okay, a Stalinist communist is as bad as a Nazi. Okay, on the other side, a social democrat is pro-union, pro-labor, pro-nationalization of some industries like, I don't know, the railroads, and pro like public education and public health care. But that's a democratic ideology. It's an ideology that is very important in Europe. The left in Europe is like that, social democratic. And so when people use social democrat as an insult in the US, or like say, oh, social democrats are nothing like communists, are absolutely like communists, you can tell them, no, social democrats and communists are very, very different. Just like a conservative is very different from a fascist. They are two very different things. Okay? And so, coming now to fascism, the other extreme ideology. Fascism, as you might know, was invented in my native country of Italy. I am not proud of that. And so it's based in these ideas of nationalism and national purity, okay, the purity of the race. And the idea is that the collective is more important than the individual, and in particular, the nation is more important than the individual, okay? It took the ideas of nationalism, which had originally been to liberate some populations, liberate some people, took them to a new level and made them very authoritarian, and linked them with the idea of violence, of power, of domination. One of the original mottos of the fascists of Mussolini was, in Italian, me ne frego, which means I don't care, okay? Which means that you have just to believe, to obey, and to fight, okay? And that minorities don't matter. All that matters is the supremacy of our people. In that case, it was the Italians in the 1920s and 30s, and then in other cases, it was other nations. We know that Nazi Germany was inspired by fascism, and today's fascists or white nationalists believe in that kind of ideology, okay, or they say they do. Also, very important for today, and one of the reasons why some politicians of the right get called fascists is because fascists were rooted in a hate for intellectuals, okay? Also, they were anti-science. They were like for recovery of like the national traditions, like old style. Mussolini used the symbols of ancient Rome, for example, and hated modernity, intellectualism. Mussolini hated the English language that was used in some vocabulary for like science and so on. And so fascism is a form of extreme nationalist that is only for the core people of a certain nation. I think you can understand this. And the book does a very good job at explaining it, okay? So this is the end of the first video.